Typically, when I'm invited into a friend's pulpit, I am really good about making sure there's a great anecdote, something that you don't know about your pastor, and I forgot to do that today. But that will just be your charge if you stay for lunch, because I'm very good at extemporaneous speaking, and by then, I am sure that I will have something to say, some story to tell. So let that be your little invitation. Let's pretend that we're in a good old-fashioned Sunday school class or a Bible study group, and I said something to you akin to, do you remember the story of the woman who anointed Jesus? What do you remember? Was it his feet? Was it his head? It was expensive perfume. No, it was his tears. It was her tears. It was early in his ministry, in the presence of close friends of Jesus. That's probably your pastor's kid. No, it was later. The woman was Mary, sister of Martha. No, it definitely was not. It was a random prostitute. Who said anything about prostitute? Or maybe your class is like many that I've taught and they just stare blankly. And you wonder if they remember anything at all. I'm sure that doesn't happen here, though. This is a case of the classic four gospel mix-up. When a story appears with variations in all four gospels and our brains create one narrative to make things easier for ourselves. Or we may just pick a favorite that gets told the most and we forget about the others. Quite often, Matthew, Mark, and Luke match up more or less, and John goes off and does some elusive, mystical, symbolic thing. But this time, Luke has some literary tricks up his sleeve. It is a similar story, but with a different setting, leaving scholars giddy with things to debate about. Who was this woman? Where are they, and why? Fortunately, or unfortunately for you, depending on your interest, I am not a scholar. You get one of those every week in your pulpit. There's my extemporaneous. You get one of those in your pulpit every week, and so you just get a break today, I guess. What I am is a storyteller. Every story is a work of art to me, meant to be seen for the richness of its settings, its characters, and their choices. So, setting. Dorothea H. Birchman from Durham University, the one across the pond, writes about hospitality customs at the time of Jesus that give us a better understanding of why we see some of the reactions that we do in this story. There is one word you need to keep in mind: reciprocity. Do you remember the story of Abraham and the three visitors who announced Sarah would have a son in Genesis 18? You might not remember that Abraham quickly invites them into his tent and has Sarah use the best flour to bake them each a loaf of bread for their travels. We tend to focus on Sarah laughing. This gives us something to narrow in on and condemn. And we miss this very important moment of hospitality. This practice is actually called theoxenia. It stems not from altruism, but a practice of lavish generosity because there might be angels among us. There was still a belief and custom similar to this in the time of Jesus. Welcoming the stranger in case the traveler was divine was a matter of sacred obligation, with potential divine reciprocity and favor to be shown at a later date. Then there was the less risky form of hospitality to the traveler when they were of the same tribe or religion, still expected. And in that case, divine or delayed human reciprocity was possible. It may be 2-for-1 special there. Both the person and God would favor you. The early church relied heavily on this practice as missionaries found sanctuary in the homes of strangers. Wandering prophets also made their way by this means, and sometimes this seems to be true of Jesus and his disciples. It is believed this practice developed into what we have kept today and around the world, and it's known as church potlucks. It's not known as church potlucks. Birchman would call it balanced reciprocity. I show up with my best pan of brownies, forget that they came from a box mix. That's neither here nor there. And while you're cooking, I grab the scissors from your 3-year-old, and not just because I fear for my thighs, but I love your child like mine. I have known your child as long as mine, and in the next month or two, we do this again at my house, and who really is the guest is fuzzy. It's not like you're gonna knock when you come over or ask where the forks are. Guest becomes so at home. Well, Jesus shows up with a big old pan of nothing every time. He doesn't exactly have a kitchen wherever he's camping out or on the move. Luke makes a special choice to develop narrative around Jesus as a homeless vagabond. It doesn't mean it wasn't true, it just means it was important to Luke that his readers know it. Later in Luke 9, for instance, what may be better known not as Luke 9, but a Rich Mullins song, foxes have holes, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. So, why did Simon invite a homeless man over for dinner? Jesus wasn't a typical homeless man off the street. He was a prophet or teacher, it seemed, complete with followers and miracles and plenty of baffling parables. He falls in the gray area that Birchman describes as not a community member, but not a stranger. It's a risky invite, but not the riskiest. I can't imagine it was because Jesus was known as a great dinner guest. I mean, minus that one party trick with the wine, but that was at the very beginning of his ministry, and since then, well, Jesus wasn't really that pleasant sometimes. I don't know that I'd call Jesus the funny one you invite to the party, not with all of that "you brood of vipers" rhetoric. The Pharisees didn't tend to land on the fun end of Jesus' diatribes. So if Simon didn't invite Jesus for his famous queso or his life of the party spirits, maybe just the hope he could make some spirits, we don't have much to go on as to what Simon was thinking. Was Simon thinking? I do know this. I found myself in the same spot as Simon. And I have no idea what I was inviting Jesus in for, or why. I do know this as well. If we invite Jesus in, we better be ready to lose control. We better be ready for change. Enter our second character, the woman. Former Episcopal priest Barbara Brown Taylor, in her book Altering the World, described seeing a mural of Jesus in a museum, and he has no body hair. She proclaims in this museum, and if you've heard Barbara Brown Taylor and her wit and southern drawl, she just blurts out, "Oh my gosh, he looks like a 6-year-old. What was this artist thinking?" And she's standing beside this other woman who she didn't really notice was in her vicinity. And this woman was her senior, was well-to-do, and as she's standing there with Barbara Brown Taylor, she is just mortified. And Taylor hears under her breath, "I can't believe you're saying this to me. I cannot believe you're saying this to me." It was as if hearing this thought is now a burden she must carry with herself always. We still have enough Gnostic Puritan influence running through our veins that we often disembody our faith and ourselves from anything fleshly. We judge anything that involves a gut reaction. We let the Puritan culture that brought us here continue to reign. We shackle each other and ourselves in shame as we look down at the ones of us who are doing the hardest things among us, being vulnerable, honest, and we say, "Oh, they're bound to get hurt." But who's doing the hurting? Of course, we are granted wisdom for a reason, but this woman is practicing these things at the feet of Jesus. Have you ever noticed how many of our spiritual practices ask us to return to the awareness of our bodies or use our bodies? To reconnect our hearts, our minds, our souls, and yes, our bodies so that we might obey the greatest commandment and love fully. To love God with everything and then our neighbors. Maybe even this woman. I like to think this woman was way ahead of Simon in this way, who couldn't even get out of his own head. When did the legalism of the day become the better way of keeping the faith tradition alive? I have to wonder if some of us have had some similar disagreements lately. When it feels like our faith tradition is being tested from the inside out, what do? Is the answer to shore up our midrash or the prayers of our feet? One of my favorite interfaith heroes is Rabbi Yeshua Abraham Heschel. You may have heard of Heschel or not, but you have probably seen a picture of Heschel on the walk across Rocket Selma. He's a couple people over. He is the very obviously white man in the picture with a beard next to MLK. And he marches many times and is a collaborator with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, just after his assassination was Passover, and he was supposed to be at Heschel's house celebrating. This was their relationship. But before that, Heschel was a man who, his parents were lost in the Holocaust. He had survived. He gets to the States. He's a scholar. He's in New York Seminary, doing all the things he does, and he's become very ivory tower about his faith because the nitty-gritty brings in the theodicy, brings in the reality of a God who allows a Holocaust. He wasn't known so much as one of the people, but he was so compelled by the civil rights movement, by this moment to speak about things that were wrong in society, even in the face of such danger and persecution, that he travels to meet MLK and he joins the walk. And in his reflections, he talks about it was like he was praying with his feet. Well, his synagogue wasn't so happy because he had missed some important moments in their life. He hadn't spent Sabbath with them. In fact, he maybe wasn't even keeping Sabbath in some of those meetings. And it's there that Heschel challenges them. What it means for this great scholar and writer to not just be knowing about and following in his mind, but to pray with his feet. Sure, I missed prayers with my community, but my feet got to pray with the people of the world. When I look at Simon and I ask this question, is the answer to shore up our midrash or the prayers of our feet? I think we get some pretty good hints. I don't know that he physically needs to fall at the feet of Jesus to be forgiven, and I think we could interchangeably use the word healed for forgiven. But intellectually, he needs the same kind of humbling as this woman displayed, since that was the place he seemed to work from, and it seemed to be what was keeping him from experiencing Jesus. That intellectual stumbling block. He deflected, right? He asked a lofty question, made it theoretical, an intellectual discourse. He just couldn't get there. And Jesus made sure that his miracle took him to town. But that's not the point, because he just couldn't get there. And Simon, I feel you, buddy. Maybe I wouldn't be bold enough to call out this woman, but to turn off my mind long enough to embrace the beauty of the moment? Yeah, I don't know. Would I have understood why she was praised by Jesus for causing a scene and making a nuisance of herself while I was asking good theological questions and trying to stick to the clear law set before me? The kind I'm good at following. But Luke's gospel is about living in the upside down. It's the kingdom of God that turns everything on its head. It's about inviting the dinner guest that won't reciprocate, that sits at your table and tells you what you've got wrong about the world from the way they're experiencing it, and it might just conflict with the way you live, with the way you want your programs to function. Transforming missions requires foregoing gatekeeping. It requires not just one-way bridge making, but to be able to get us more easily through our program. It requires not just one-way bridge making so that we can get through more easily our programs, our services. It requires what Dr. Roberto Espinoza calls bridging. The state that a bridge is just a road, another road. I stayed to my right, you stayed yours. That's what bridges do, unless there's conversation on the bridge. Conversation that happens in passing. A transformed mission does not just create a more accessible way for them to get to us, where we will give our best hospitality when they get here, nor is it about jaunts across the bridge to converse with those other people that are the object of our missions. We built it to make it easier for us. No, bridging is about the conversations and relationships that occur while both parties are traversing the bridge. It's inviting more of this upside down living into your life to experience Jesus the way Simon missed and in the way this woman deeply understood. So much so, she was overwhelmed by his presence and didn't care about the way things were supposed to be. She let down her hair. She wept at his feet. And she anointed him with her best because she wasn't holding back. She wasn't going for the life of a follower that hopes the rules are enough because what's inside is too scary to reveal. She brought herself, her flesh, her emotions, her identity, and laid it out there in front of everyone. Now as a church, UBC, and as individuals here today, you get to decide, do we rejoice with this woman? Do we do what Jesus did and put her in a place that I believe was eye to eye, where he sees her and he looks at her and says, you are enough. Go in peace. Can we honestly extend a welcome home? You belong here? For us Simons, we can do it. We just have to believe we belong, even if we break a societal rule or expectation to show this kind of love. Simon had already taken the risk inviting Jesus. He just didn't know how to give himself credit. So Simons, you belong too. UBC has been asked to bring themselves to the table, and for some of you that has already meant falling at the feet of Jesus with nothing but tears and the anointing with the best you had. And remember, Jesus offered hospitality as the guest. Not pastor, not paid staff, guest. Luke's radical upside-down hospitality of the table, eating with Pharisees, showing grace to Zacchaeus the tax collector, the prodigal, and the feast that brings both joy and conflict, the final meal at Emmaus with the breaking of bread. Most of these stories are unique to Luke. This alarming cycle of disruption is recognized by the marginalized who so desperately need the disruption who need this disruption so that those that despise them, who need that institutionalized structure to be upheld for their own gains by procedures and positions, for their own sense of belonging to remain intact. The marginalized need not just the disruption, but for those who need all of those things to hear these stories. We miss the divine moment happening in front of them. Who cares who entered the space in what role? Guest, host, servant, sinner. Look what's happening here. UBC, as you take on the task of transforming mission, You're going to have to work extra hard to remind each other that you believe in an embodied faith, where you pray with your feet and you love with your hands and your hugs. You can start transforming mission by practicing as a congregation with each other. When you look at each other, and don't assume that everyone is feeling seen, but in this embodied faith, you use your mouths and say, I am so glad you're here. Or, I have missed you, and I'm glad to see you today. I don't know you, and I probably should because our kids are in this class together or go to the same school, and my name is. Because at the end of the day, Jesus had a word for both Simon and the woman in this story. And he has a word for all of us. Offer hospitality that fosters belonging. Be a host, be a guest. You are not too good or too broken. Hear this word from Jesus today. Amen.